In many ways, the Bosnian War was a horrible reminder of why we need to study history and why we need to heed the lessons of the past. It's all too easy to say, well, that could never happen here. That could never happen in the modern day. Or it's easy to say, that particular event was so long ago, so why should we care about it? Or some people might say, we should never compare historical events to more modern issues because it's impossible to make one-to-one comparisons and no two events are exactly the same. But the reality is it can happen again. It can happen here. We should care. And although two historical events are never exactly the same, it's useful to learn about history and compare events so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. As the Bosnian War blew up in the 1990s, the UN and the international community seemed completely caught off guard. It was almost as if they had no idea that events like ethnic cleansing or genocide or total war could ever happen again, and nobody seemed to know what to do. While the war was happening in Bosnia, it sort of had this two-part character. The first part was this siege of Sarajevo that we've talked quite a bit about, and this was something that was often in the news, something that the UN was focusing on, the international community around the world, because journalists and international people were in Sarajevo, which is an international city. What was going on there was pretty well known, and it was shocking and horrifying. But the other part of the war was much less known, and slowly, as the war unfolded, by the time 1994 and 1995 rolled around, the true magnitude of what was happening in eastern Bosnia and rural Bosnia began to become known to the international community. Journalist Joe Sacco was there in eastern Bosnia towards the end of the war, and he wrote what's really an amazing and unique book about the people he lived with in eastern Bosnia and how this crazy war affected them. The book's called Safe Area Gorazde. What makes Joe Sacco and his book Safe Area Gorazde unique in particular is that more or less it's actually a comic book. So Sacco spent time in East Bosnia, and the interviews and the primary sources and the depictions of everyday life are still historically rigorous and have journalistic integrity, but instead of writing more of a traditional book about it, Sacco decided to use his artistic talents to not only paint the picture with words, but literally paint the picture with his artistic illustrations. The result, in my view, is an incredibly effective way to get not only Joe Sacco's message across, but the message of the people who had something to say in Gorazde and in eastern Bosnia across. The style of the book basically forces you to look at what was happening, not just read about it, but actually visually see it, and that visual reaction can be powerful. I've also come across some of Sacco's work when I was looking through some research on World War I, and he does a very effective job again in that case of depicting the horrors of trench warfare accurately and more in depth than simple words can do. At any rate, Sacco starts his book Safe Area Gorazde more or less with a brief history lesson. For several decades after World War II, the country of Yugoslavia in southeastern Europe was a communist country held together by a brutal but fairly well-liked dictator inside of Yugoslavia known as Tito. After Tito died in the 1980s, a man named Slobodan Milosevic gained power by encouraging and exploiting Serb nationalism and calls for a greater Serbia where all of the people that are Serb in ethnicity can get together and live in the same territory with their own people. In response to this growing nationalism in Serbia, the other republics of Yugoslavia began to grow their own nationalism in response. So what was once a united communist country was now splintering off into these nationalistic ethnic zones, basically. In particular, Croatia, as they saw the rising tide of Serb nationalism inside Yugoslavia, wanted to break away from the Serbs and from Yugoslavia. In Croatia, in 1991, a brutal war broke out between the government of Croatia and the people of Croatia and a large Serb minority who viewed the Croatian government as the same people who collaborated with the Nazis all of those years ago. And so, supported by Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia and the Yugoslav People's Army, which Milosevic controlled, the Serbs brutally dislodged or killed Croat civilians and launched a brutal war, which they viewed as a preemptive strike before they could be victimized themselves. Talking about the Serb gains in Croatia during this preemptive war before the Bosnian War, Joe Sacco says, quote, "In the territory they consolidated, the Serbs brutally cleansed themselves of Croatian civilians. The Serbs were convinced they were preempting their own victimization by what they perceived to be a resurgent Ustasha state. Their nationalist leaders had used the ethnic crimes of the past to fuel a new cycle of ethnic violence in order to shatter the notion of brotherhood and unity forever." End quote. Just as a reminder there, the Ustasha is a name for the Croatian government during World War II that was essentially allied with the Nazi Party. So these Serbs in Croatia who saw Croatian nationalism increasing as a result of Serbian nationalism increasing began to get worried that perhaps they would fall victim to Croat atrocities like they did during World War II, and so they launched their own preemptive ethnic strike. To me, this is why nationalism can be a dangerous thing, where you sort of get caught up in this cycle of atrocities, and the crimes of the past become justification for the crimes of the future. At any rate, while all this is going on, the Republic of Bosnia is at a crossroads. Bosnia was also a part of a communist Yugoslavia, but once that communist rule falls apart, Bosnia now has to decide what to do. Do we splinter off like Slovenia and Croatia have done, or do we follow another course? What ends up happening is three political parties, for the most part partitioned along ethnic lines in Bosnia, Serb, Croat, and Muslim, are competing for power, and eventually the Bosnian government begins to pursue independence. After this, the Bosnian Serb political party essentially leaves the government and forms its own assembly and its own state inside of Bosnia, known as the Serb Republic. The leader of these Bosnian Serbs was a man named Radovan Karadzic. He would later be sentenced to prison time for war crimes, but at any rate, his intentions were clear. At the beginning of the war, he said, quote, "Do not think that you will not perhaps make the Muslim people disappear, because the Muslims cannot defend themselves if there is war." End quote. Sure enough, war breaks out. You have the Yugoslav People's Army controlled by Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, which essentially becomes the Bosnian Serb Army. You have paramilitary groups as well as Serb nationalists who join the cause, and all of these groups are against the Bosnian government, which is essentially just anyone who's willing to defend Bosnia at this point. When the war began in April of 1992, those Serb paramilitary groups and Serb nationalists and Yugoslav People's Armies controlled by Serbs began moving into villages in East Bosnia, displacing and killing civilians. They began the siege of Sarajevo, which we've gone over, and the war was on. Because this was a nationalistic war, it was always going to have the character of ethnic cleansing and displacement of peoples from their homes. You have to remember that that was the goal of the Serb cause. Greater Serbia, a place where all of the Serb people can live together without any of those other ethnicities to bother them. In order to accomplish that goal, they were going to have to displace Muslims from their homes or Croats from their homes, and that's exactly what they started to do in East Bosnia. So as the siege of Sarajevo, the big international city, gained much of the headlines in the international newspapers, this ethnic cleansing and this displacement of, in particular, Muslims from their homes in East Bosnia was sort of flying under the radar. With the backstory now covered, Joe Sacco begins to talk about the town of Gorazde. Gorazde was a town in southeast Bosnia. It had about 9,600 Muslims and 5,600 Serbs, by and large coexisting with each other throughout the decades after World War II. But once the war broke out, the Bosnian Serb army surrounded Gorazde, much as they surrounded Sarajevo, and life began to get difficult for the Muslims living in the town. The Bosnian Serb army cut off the running water, they cut off the electricity, and they cut off the roads to get into the town. So you now had a situation where people in Gorazde had to do whatever it took to survive. People used wood stoves basically in order to do everything. Boil water, clean clothes, cook, heat the house. Again, there was no running water or electricity. People rigged up these water wheel contraptions on the river near Gorazde in order to power different things very inefficiently. Because of that lack of power and that lack of resources, the villagers of the town at night began to call the darkness the deep dark. Within a few weeks of the war breaking out in May of 1992, the Bosnian Serb army was ready for its first attack on the village of Gorazde. As much of the village fled while being shot at and shelled and killed by the Bosnian Serb army, old neighbors and former friends of the Muslims who were fleeing burned down houses, looted, and even killed indiscriminately, while the Muslim citizens of Gorazde who managed to escape looked on from the safety of the other side of the river. A resident of Gorazde talks about what it was like to watch as his house was burned down. Quote, "Then one of those guys told me exactly who had burned down my house. It was our neighbors. Dado, 3 years younger than me, and one called Akko and his brother Miro. We used to play football together. We used to go out at night. And if we didn't go out, we used to spend the evenings together on our street." End quote. Eventually, the Bosnian army would retake Gorazde from the Bosnian Serb army, and so the Muslims were able to return to their destroyed and burnt out houses to find their possessions looted, their houses destroyed, and even dead bodies and the charred remains of husks littered throughout the city. In response, many began to loot Serb homes that had been abandoned when Serbs abandoned the village because now the Bosnian army was in control and the cycle of violence continued. But not before a mass grave was discovered. One of the residents of Gorazde tells Sacco, quote, "It was terrible smelling. Worms, death. We recognized them mainly from their clothes, but also from their hair and the features of their faces. There was still skin. The total was 7. From that 7, 2 were my best friends." End quote. The toll from this first round of violence in Gorazde was horrible, and it kicked off and foreshadowed what was to come. With the Bosnian army now back in control of Gorazde and the people of Gorazde back in their homes, they did the best they could to maintain life as they normally would live it. Kids struggled to attend school. There were very few materials, even few teachers. There were often interruptions of months to years where school would be canceled due to the violence and the chaos that was going on around them. Many times teachers had to go serve in the Bosnian army. Sometimes parents just didn't think it was safe enough for kids to walk down the street as they were being sniped at and shelled by the Bosnian Serb army on the hilltops. So they held their kids out of school. the river next to Gorazde often saw the dead bodies of Muslims floating down the river from other places in East Bosnia. This combined with the situation at schools, the situation where homes and lives had been destroyed already. There was no power, there was very little food or money. Much like in Sarajevo, cigarettes became a sort of way to barter with people. Packs of cigarettes were distributed by the Bosnian army and used to pay teachers, soldiers, nurses, doctors, so on and so forth. Remember that although the Bosnian Serb army no longer controlled Gorazde, they controlled the hills around Gorazde and they controlled the roads into Gorazde. So nothing was coming in, nothing was going out, and it was effectively a siege situation. And while that siege situation was going on, towards the end of 1992, the population of Gorazde was exploding. By the tens of thousands, refugees were pouring into Gorazde from other areas in eastern Bosnia where they were fleeing death and ethnic cleansing because they felt like Gorazde was safer because it was now controlled by the Bosnian army. These refugees brought with them the horrible stories of death and rape and murder from other parts of Bosnia, and they filled the minds of the people of Gorazde with these horror stories, and they also filled the hospital at Gorazde with what was, according to Joe Sacco, a horror show. The hospital had no choice but to continue to operate. They couldn't complain about a lack of electricity or a lack of running water because they had to do the best they could to save as many lives as they could. Over the course of the war at the hospital at Gorazde, there were 3,000 to 4,000 major operations, tens of thousands of wounds tended to, and you can understand if the head doctor at the hospital at Gorazde was upset at his lack of supplies and what he viewed as a lack of support from the outside world, and particularly the UN, who supposedly is supposed to protect civilians from the death and the destruction of war. He said, quote, "I can't understand why the rest of the world hasn't intervened more forcefully. The UN is always pointing out its neutrality, even now. Neutral in what? In a slaughter of lambs by wolves?" End quote. This is where we get to the part in the story that has always been controversial, and it comes up a lot in the book, and it comes up a lot for the people of Gorazde and the people of East Bosnia, because in many cases they felt abandoned by the UN and by the international community. With no way to get supplies in or out of Gorazde, the UN did make the effort to send trucks in order to send food, medicine, and supplies into the town, but the reality was the UN trucks were few and far between. And there was actually plenty of examples of UN trucks being turned around at Bosnian Serb checkpoints and actually never making it into Gorazde. There were some journalists and TV crews that made it into the town, but a lot of times it was quick hitters. Get in and out, get the shot, move on, tell a quick 30-second story, and then move on to the bigger, more impressive story, at least to the international news media, which was what was going on in Sarajevo. This quick hitter form of TV journalism contrasted to what Joe Sacco was doing, which was a more long form, actually get to know the people of Gorazde, live with them, eat with them, talk with them. And Sacco is very critical of what he sees as sort of a modern day cable news approach to doing journalism. At any rate, perhaps as a result of some of this news exposure, the United States and the UN began doing airdrops into Gorazde, dropping valuable supplies into the town, or at least nearby the town, to help people survive, which was a good thing. But the reality was the logistics of grabbing the supplies often led to chaos and violence. You had desperate people in packs, basically looking out for themselves in many cases, fighting over the very limited supplies, and at times during these airdrop situations, things could get violent or chaotic. Ultimately, in 1993, the UN declared Gorazde and several other places in East Bosnia and rural Bosnia as quote-unquote safe areas. There was a ton of confusion about what this actually meant. Did this mean that the towns that were declared safe areas were under UN protection? Did this mean that the UN would fight back if Bosnian Serb armies attacked these areas? No one was really sure. But one thing about these safe areas that upset the people of Bosnia, particularly the Muslims of Gorazde, was that if you declare all of these areas safe areas, what you're actually doing is implicitly legitimizing all the Serb territorial gains and giving them incentive to take over everything that's not a safe area. Basically, some view it as some form of appeasement where the UN was basically saying, okay, well, the Bosnian Serbs might have done some ethnic cleansing and they might have displaced a couple 100,000 people in these areas, but we'll let them have that as long as they don't do anything in these few safe areas. Another reason the Bosnian government and others were critical of the way the UN handled these safe areas was that it also incentivized Bosnian Serb armies and paramilitaries and extreme nationalists to simply herd Muslims into areas that were not safe areas, and then they could do whatever they wanted with them. Joe Sacco talks about this a little bit, quote, "In early May of 1993, the UN extended safe area status to other Bosnian enclaves, including Gorazde. But the UN had yet to work out what the concept meant. On the one hand, the UN was obligating itself, presumably, to keep the safe areas safe. On the other, the safe areas implicitly formalized Serb gains and the concentration of Muslims into what President Clinton warned would become, quote-unquote, shooting galleries, which didn't stop the U.S. from supporting the plan. Not waiting for further clarification, the Serbs launched an offensive that conquered all government territory from Medeta to Justa Praća. Refugees streamed into Gorazde while the Serbs began a relentless bombardment of the town." End quote. Again, nobody seemed to know what the safe area term actually meant, and the Bosnian Serb army wasn't about to wait around for clarification. There were times where it seemed like the safe areas only seemed to apply if there were official UN troops stationed there. But even then, that didn't stop the Bosnian Serb army in some places from shelling or attacking these quote-unquote safe areas. Hundreds would die by shelling in Gorazde alone by the end of 1993. The safe area status also didn't prevent the Bosnian Serb army from continuing to block the roads and block any supplies from getting into Gorazde. And because there was very little food, medicine, or supplies that were getting into Gorazde, particularly not from the UN, the people of Gorazde had to go out and get them themselves. This journey was known as the White Death, and it was a journey from Gorazde to a secret path and enclave of the Bosnian army in Serb territory, which was a couple miles away from Gorazde. And in order to get there, people had to climb through a frozen wilderness uphill in mountainous territory, carrying sometimes dozens of pounds of weight on backpacks while incredibly malnourished, and many people actually died from this journey along the White Death. At the end of the day, the UN, while they did make some efforts to help, ultimately rarely had the ability to use any force, and as a result, Bosnian Serb nationalists simply ignored many of their warnings and ignored their quote-unquote safe area status that they bestowed upon some of these towns in East Bosnia, and the results would be devastating. And they were devastating not just for the Muslims who were living in East Bosnia, but it's also worth discussing the plight of the Serbs who stayed in Gorazde. Many Serbs did not want to leave their homes, or they simply didn't agree with what the Bosnian Serb army was doing, and they stayed in Gorazde with their neighbors and their friends. But they had to deal with a double burden of fear. At the end of the day, most Muslims treated them humanely and with respect, but the Serb nationalists would actually often target them with shells and sniper fire. So if you were a Serb and you stayed in Gorazde, you were viewed as a traitor and sometimes even worse than the Muslims who they were fighting against. In addition to having to worry about the Bosnian Serbs, there were some instances of violence by Muslims against Serbs, and although these instances were in the minority when you talk about the overall scale of the war, that doesn't help the Serb victims who had to deal with this. In particular, it was refugees who had very little patience for Serbs in Gorazde. So typically the Muslims of the town that lived there would often treat Serbs humanely and with respect, but the refugees who had just come from a place where they had seen family members and friends killed or ethnically cleansed, or they were kicked out of their homes by Bosnian Serb forces, those refugees probably understandably had very little patience for Serbs, and they often forced them out of their homes or destroyed property. And many Serbs in Gorazde were eventually placed near the police station for protection, as even some Serbs were murdered and harassed, particularly during Bosnian Serb offenses into the town. This idea brings up the paradox of this whole war. The Bosnian Serbs were fighting for a ethnically partitioned Bosnia where Serbs could live in one spot and Muslims could live in another spot. The Bosnian army, on the other hand, was fighting for a international and inclusive and inter-ethnic Bosnia where everybody could live together. But the reality is that idea is going to be tough after the brutality of this war. It's going to be tough to go back to coexisting after all of the atrocities and all of the crimes that were perpetrated during this war. The people of Gorazde were split on whether or not they could ever live with Serbs again and go back to being neighbors and friends. Some simply said they would never do it. They could never regain the trust after all the horrors perpetrated by the Bosnian Serb army. Some made distinctions between war criminals and normal people, and others were much more willing to forgive regardless of the situation. One woman in Gorazde said, quote, "The Serbs can't be trusted. They lie. The only reason some Serbs remained in Gorazde was because they were afraid of losing their homes." End quote. Another person said, quote, "I understand Serbs lived with us during the war, especially in Sarajevo, but I'm suspicious of them. I can't help it. I don't have the same feelings for them I had before. They can visit me if they want, but I can't feel comfortable with them again." End quote. Another person said, quote, "I can live with Serbs again, but not those guilty of crimes. I'm quite aware of the loyal Serbs living in Sarajevo. I can't understand it. About 90% of my friends were Serbs. Older people said that Serbs hated Muslims, but we didn't believe them." End quote. Another person said, quote, "They're not all Chetniks. There are good people there too." End quote. You begin to understand this mixed feeling and the different levels of response from the people in Gorazde and how conflicted they all were about their feelings on this idea of community and living together again. What happened in 1994 and 1995 in East Bosnia was going to make this even more difficult. In February of 94, the UN threatened airstrikes on the Serb artillery and tanks that were punishing Sarajevo. There was enough international momentum finally to get the UN to do something about the siege of Sarajevo. And they threatened airstrikes at the Bosnian Serb positions if they didn't back down and stop destroying Sarajevo. So the Bosnian Serb forces did stop shelling Sarajevo for a time. But the problem was they simply turned all of those weapons that they weren't using on Sarajevo and used them in East Bosnia. They turned their tanks and their bombs on Gorazde, and no one seemed to care in the international community as an assault destroyed Gorazde once again. As tanks and artillery and snipers closed in on Gorazde in April of 94, and as the UN and the US and the international community looked on, the UN ordered a secret evacuation of their military observers from Gorazde. Just to pause here to clarify that, you now have a United Nations that knows exactly what's happening, as a safe area is about to be violated and attacked, as civilians are about to be bombed and killed, and unfolding scholarship in the modern day continues to suggest that many at the top levels of the UN knew or were at least worried about genocidal intent in East Bosnia, yet they did nothing to stop it. When people look back at the Bosnian War and they rake the UN and the US and the international community through the coals for allowing this to happen, this is the moment of the story that they're talking about. The Bosnian Serb army overran Gorazde, intensified the barrage, and then left in a storm of fire and death and loss and refugees. Utter destruction. 700 were killed, 2,000 were wounded. Here's Joe Sacco talking about the 1994 Bosnian Serb offensive in Gorazde. Quote, "With the unrelenting Serb attack and mounting death toll dominating headlines, Gorazde had become a symbol of the meaninglessness of the safe area concept specifically, and the impotence of the international community generally. Facing the seemingly imminent collapse of Gorazde and a loss in its own credibility in foreign affairs, the Clinton administration reversed course again. The U.S. got NATO backing to pressure the UN Secretary General to request NATO airstrikes to deter attacks against the safe areas, and not just the UN personnel within them." End quote. As the United States and the UN and NATO scrambled over what to do, oftentimes worrying about not wanting to take too big of a role on one side or the other and wanting to remain quote-unquote neutral, the Bosnian Serb forces continued to bomb innocent civilians in places all over Bosnia. They reneged on agreements, they targeted civilians, they even took UN personnel hostage in order to get airstrikes to stop against their positions. Joe Sacco says, quote, "On June 9th, the UN's top civilian representative in the area, Yasushi Akashi, indicated the UN would back away from confrontation with the Serbs. It would, quoting Akashi now, abide strictly by peacekeeping principles." Joe Sacco continues, "Satisfied the UN had been cowed, General Mladic now turned his attention to eastern Bosnia and its safe areas." End quote. Top UN general in Bosnia, Lieutenant General Rose, spoke about what he saw in Gorazde after the 1994 offensive. Quote, "The situation was a lot better than I had been led to believe. The town had not been destroyed to the level which I expected." End quote. So here you have the top UN official in Bosnia saying that by the UN's own numbers, 700 killed, 2,000 wounded is not the level that he expected to see as far as destruction goes. So for him and for the UN, the suffering and the death of thousands of people is not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. And you begin to understand, as the UN continued to allow Bosnian Serb aggression in East Bosnia and downplay the ethnic cleansing and murder of thousands of people, you begin to understand why people are to this day so bitter about what happened. The late philosopher Christopher Hitchens, who actually writes the foreword to the book Safe Area Gorazde, talks about how frustrating and angry it makes you when you read this story and you learn about the Bosnian War and you see time and time again as the UN reneges on their promises, refuses to protect innocent civilians, and generally all in the name of quote-unquote neutrality stands aside while thousands die. He says, quote, "Where there is bile in these pages, and I quite frankly could have done with several more pints and quarts of it, it is not directed at quote-unquote the Serbs. Even in their extremity, Bosnian victims referred to Serbo-fascists as Chetniks, and thus honorably agreed to load them under a political and historical and not an ethnic rubric. No, the contempt is reserved for the temporizing, buck-passing, butt-covering peacekeepers who strove to find that swamp of low moral and middle ground into which the innocent end up being shoveled by the aggressive. Why was that road from Sarajevo to Gorazde so impassable? It had been wide open through several decades of inefficient state socialism, after all. Why did NATO armies, readied through the same decades to launch a thermonuclear war on a moment's notice, find it inconvenient to face down a flimsy roadblock manned by a rabble of drunken racists? Nobody who witnessed this miserable spectacle will ever forget it. Nor will he wonder how some of the worst deeds in human history came to be committed in plain sight and without shame." End quote. It's a powerful and emotional quote there, but it highlights the feeling that many of these people had as quote-unquote safe area after safe area was overrun by the Bosnian Serb army, and thousands of people were displaced, murdered, or wounded in this attack. The worst of it, and what is now referred to simply as the Bosnian Genocide, occurred in East Bosnia at one of these safe areas known as Srebrenica. Early on in the war, Muslim refugees and fighters looted and burned homes as vengeance for what the Serbs were doing. But in 1995, the Bosnian Serb army retook the town, and what happened next is tough to read about, much less think about. Joe Sacco talks about what happened. Quote, "Mladic launched his attack on Srebrenica in July of 1995. His forces brushed aside the Dutch peacekeepers stationed there and took some of them hostage. The Dutch put up no resistance themselves, but called for air support to halt the Serbs 6 times. Their requests were turned down or postponed by top UN officers, even after the Dutch themselves came under attack. Finally, 5 days after the first request, 2 NATO planes made bombing runs. They were ineffective. The Serbs threatened to kill their Dutch hostages and shell panicked civilians if NATO attacked again. In any case, it was too late. Bosnian soldiers who had believed the UN would defend the safe area put up an ineffectual defense. The Serbs entered Srebrenica." End quote. Most of the male Muslim population of Srebrenica felt they had no choice but to attempt to break out of the town, push through the Bosnian Serb lines, and reach the Bosnian army, where they could hopefully organize a defense and retake the town before too much damage was done. This seems preferable to many fighters rather than surrendering. So the men of the town formed a column of 2, and that column attempted to break through Serb lines, push through, and make it to Bosnian Serb territory. The women and the children and the elderly and the men not of fighting age were left behind, and that column as a whole never made it to Bosnian territory. The column was harassed and ambushed by Serb units. It was shelled. Some eyewitness accounts tell of gas attacks. The UN was never able to prove that, one way or the other. Many were captured or decided to return on their own to Srebrenica. And meanwhile, General Ratko Mladic and the Bosnian Serb army was separating most of the women and children, and as Dutch UN peacekeepers watched, the women and children were separated from the men. They were put in a holding facility and eventually told they would get on a bus back to Bosnian territory in safety. But the Muslim men and boys of fighting age were separated from the rest, led to the outskirts of Srebrenica, and they were exterminated. Most were shot into mass graves. Over 7,000 were killed in this way, the largest mass killing since the Holocaust. The UN and the international community has since called this a genocide. So much for the term safe area. Gorazde was actually the last one left standing. As news of the genocide at Srebrenica and the humiliation of the UN spread, NATO increasingly took control over the situation, launching airstrikes that were more targeted, more direct, and more effective, ultimately more intense air campaigns. This, combined with major gains from the Croatian army and the Bosnian army, as well as increasing aid from the United States and the Clinton administration, particularly in North Bosnia. Even Slobodan Milosevic began to pressure the Bosnian Serb cause to sue for peace, and the Bosnian Serbs felt cornered, and a peace deal was imminent by October of 1995. By November of 95, the Dayton Agreement was signed between the different parties of Bosnia that were fighting. The town of Gorazde remained Bosnian territory and a narrow corridor of land, the same land that was once called the so-called Blue Road, where the UN supposedly would send aid and supplies, even though they often got turned aside and never reached Gorazde. But there was a corridor of land, a road that would connect it to the rest of Bosnia and Sarajevo, although some would argue logistically the road was actually never built by the UN. Gorazde still had to rely on that blue road that actually ran through Serb territory, so at any moment they could be shut off from supplies. Other safe areas like Shepa and Srebrenica were also put under Bosnian Serb control, and the rest of the country was split essentially 50-50 between the Bosnian Serb Republic and the government of Bosnia. By the end of 1995, the Bosnian War was for all intents and purposes over, but it will always leave a hole in the lives and the souls of the people who lived through it and survived it. And there will always be the lingering question of what could we have done differently as a world community to have prevented what happened at Srebrenica and places like safe area Gorazde. All right, so as always, thanks for listening. During this version here of the post-podcast Yakety Yak, I do have some announcements and some new directions for the podcast in the coming year. It feels appropriate here at the end of the year to kind of go over some of this stuff. So here we go. The podcast is going to carry on as usual this year, which I'm looking forward to. But over the years, some of you have reached out and asked if there is a way to support the podcast. And I've always said the best thing to do is just to tell a friend or leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or whatever platform you're listening to on. And that is still absolutely true, and I still encourage you to do that. But I've also decided here to start a Patreon for those that want to support in a more tangible way. For those that don't know, Patreon is a service that allows you to donate a certain amount on a per episode basis. You can put in any amount, but I've set up a couple of tiers, and with each tier, you get some bonuses. So at the $1 an episode tier, you'll get a sort of monthly recommendations newsletter with stuff that I've been into, whether it's music or movies, TV, podcasts, sports, books, history papers, philosophy stuff. So I think I intentionally play things pretty close to the vest on the podcast as far as my personal approach, I guess you could say. So I'm hoping this ends up being a little bit of a way to kind of get behind the scenes of some of the things that make me tick and some of the other things I can share that I might think are important that aren't necessarily related to the podcast. So some of you might be interested in that, some of you might not be, and that's fine. All right, so at $2 an episode, you'll get access to a bonus feed with extra episodes of the podcast. So I'm actually pretty excited about this. Over the years, I've had ideas for shows that I've spent time planning and researching, and in some cases, even recording. But at the end of the day, I just didn't feel like they fit with what I'm trying to do overall in the main podcast feed, or maybe it didn't fit with that series I was doing, Or maybe I was working on another episode and I got an idea but didn't really know what to do with it and kind of put it on the to-do list and never really got to it. But anyway, with this extra podcast feed, I'm going to start putting that stuff there. You'll see a variety of types of episodes. You'll get traditional type episodes that I would normally do. You'll get more cutting room floor type of stuff, things that didn't make it into the normal episodes. You'll see more philosophy, more psychology stuff that might be a little bit more, or a little bit less mainstream, I should say. I'm hoping to analyze different genres of nonfiction and maybe even start getting into analysis of different types of fiction and see how that works if it's relevant. I have some ideas for revisiting old episodes, commenting on how I would change things, or updating my thoughts on older episodes after a few years, sort of episode commentary type of stuff. I'm hopeful at some point we can get some listener selected topics that can be tackled in this bonus feed. And I'm also hopeful to do some current event stuff, maybe a little bit more commentary than I would usually give. And I feel like that would be a little bit more appropriate in this bonus feed. So I'm pretty excited about it. It could be kind of a way for me to experiment with some things and maybe get your input on it as you're listening. And I'm going to see where that goes. So you can get that at $2 an episode on the Patreon. And right off the bat, there's 2 episodes on there right now. One has to do with the bystander effect and to what extent it played a role in the Bosnian War. And the other one is a look at the famous history book called A People's History of the United States. And it's about sort of what is the role of ideology and political ideology in history? What is the role that it plays, and should there be ideological history or shouldn't there be ideological history? All right, so then there's also a $5 tier, which gets you all the stuff we just mentioned, also a few more perks, one of which would periodically give you some voting power in votes for episode topics if we were to get enough people there. And there's some other stuff on there too that you can check out. So you can find all that stuff at patreon.com/reflectinghistory. There should be a link in the episode notes on whatever platform you are listening to this on. All that being said, if you're willing and able to help out, it is greatly appreciated. If you can't at this point, I totally understand. You can still support the old-fashioned way by telling a friend or leaving a rating or review. Honestly, I'm pretty consistently amazed that anyone is even willing to listen to an episode, much less support the overall project that I'm trying to put together here. So I really do thank anyone who's willing to provide any level of support. It means a lot. And that's the end of the Yakety Yak. We have the final episode of the Bosnian War series coming out in a few weeks. I think it's going to be a good one. So look out for that and have a great new year. That's it for me. As always, thanks for listening.